2021 Plan Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Fisher?
Here. Sorry about that.
Keep?
Here.
Leak?
Here.
Hape?
Here.
Phillips? Here. Semler?
Here.
And Stewart's excused.
Thank you, Iris. We have quorum, so we'll continue on to our agenda items. First on the agenda was a council update. I don't believe we have a council update tonight. So we'll move on to the next agenda item, which is public comment. This is regarding issues not on the regular agenda. Iris, was there anyone who wished to give a public comment tonight?
No.
We'll move on then. The next agenda item is the Commission for Citizen Involvement. I didn't have any updates that I'd like to make for the Commission for Citizen Involvement. Commissioners, anything that a commissioner would like to raise for Commission for Citizen Involvement? None? I see none. So then we'll move on to the minutes. This is for the Plan Commission to review and approve the minutes from June 14th, 2021. Commissioners, are there any changes, corrections that commissioners would like to make to the minutes? None? Motion to approve the minutes of June 14th, 2021.
Second.
I move to approve.
Thank you. Commissioner Leek moves to approve. Commissioner or Vice Chair Pape seconds. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Any noes? Any abstains? All right. Commissioner Phillips abstains. All the others approve. Next are the June 8th, 2021 meeting minutes. Commissioners, any changes or corrections we'd like to make to the June 8th, 2021 meeting minutes? None?
Motion to approve.
Vice Chair Pape makes a motion to approve the minutes. Is there a second?
I second.
Commissioner Leek seconds. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any abstains? Commissioner Phillips abstains. Any noes? None? All right, thank you. The minutes are approved. So then we'd like to move on to our first item on the agenda. This is a continuance of the public hearing for LU 21-0019. Attorney Boone, is there any opening remarks that staff would like to make? Otherwise, I'd like to acknowledge the letter that we received from Attorney Cutler today.
Yes, Mr. Chair, that is the item I'd like to just deal with procedurally. Iris, the exhibit number on that?
Just a moment.
For the record. Well, while she's looking that up, we received an objection from the attorney for Jess Weissels and Emmy Spinlenhauer, saying that the commission should not proceed forward tonight and should not continue its deliberation and vote because he believes that a vote has already occurred. The application failed to receive a majority vote, and therefore the commission has made its decision. See, his objection is noted in the record. Do you have that yet, Iris?
It would be, whoops.
I recommend to the commission that we deny the objection. The commission has not reached a decision has not reached an oral decision to direct staff to prepare written findings upon which it can then prepare the written findings which the commission would then adopt, and that's the decision. Okay? This application is required to go to the City Council with the Planning Commission's recommendation, either for or against. Okay, so it is not like the lack of action takes any effect, and a split vote is no decision. It is not a decision to affirm. It is not a decision to deny. So I don't think he's correct on the law, and I would again recommend that the commission go ahead and proceed with deliberation And ultimately, we're going to need, a majority vote of those present eligible to vote to direct staff to prepare written findings so that that decision, which would be the majority of the commission, can then have written findings before it and then adopt the findings. So I would recommend that the objection be ruled out of order, I suppose, and the commission go ahead and continue with its process tonight.
Attorney Boone, one procedural question on that. Is it the chair's decision on deciding on the recommendation of staff, or should we take a vote among the commissioners?
I think you should take a vote among the commissioners to alleviate any question here. I don't.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, based on the staff's input and agreeing with staff's input that we have not given a direction to staff to either prepare findings, conclusions, and orders either for or against, I would like to make a motion that we deny the request received by Mr. Cutler on behalf of Jesse Weishuls and Emmy Spindler-Hauer, to deny that motion to not continue the meeting. So we want to continue the meeting tonight. Any opposed? Excuse me, is there a second for the motion?
A second.
So I made the motion, Commissioner Leek has seconded. Any discussion on the motion? None? All those in favor of continuing the hearing tonight and denying the request to not continue? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None? Any abstains? None. So based on the recommendation of the Plan Commission, we will continue the hearing
All
tonight.
right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And since this is a continuation of the public hearing, I guess I would ask any commission members if they need to declare any conflicts of interest, or excuse me, any ex parte communications that have arisen since the last meeting, and I hope there are none. And any bias that needs to be declared that hasn't been already, nobody's declared a bias, or any financial conflicts have arisen, any financial conflicts of interest that may have arisen since the last meeting. Okay. And
Sure.
Mr. Simler, since you specifically didn't participate in the hearing before, I would ask you, are there any ex parte contacts, including a site visit you need to declare, any bias or financial conflicts of interest?
I drove by the site this past week, but just on Boones Ferry, didn't do any extra exploration, but I went by the site.
All right, and what you saw on the site, was there anything material insofar as looking at the rest of the exhibits that you already have before you?
No.
Thank you. All right, with that, Mr. Chair, you may proceed and continue with your deliberations.
All right. So again, we'd like to continue on with our deliberations. I would like to go back a little bit and remind the commission of kind of what we're tasked with doing. So under the development code, under review procedures 5007-0003 review procedures, that's the procedure that we follow. And specifically under 5007-003, under section G, our activity is outlined by the paragraph that describes the decision of the hearing body. And I'd just like to read that the hearing body shall make a preliminary oral decision to approve with conditions pursuant to LOC 50.07.003.5, or deny an application based upon the applicable standards and criteria and the evidence and testimony in the record. The preliminary oral decision is not final decision at any time prior to the adoption of final order pursuant to subsection 4.g.ii of this section. The hearing body may modify or change its decision or choose to reopen the hearing. So again, to kind of summarize what it is that we're doing tonight, is that we're deliberating and trying to reach a decision to either deny the application based upon the applicable standards and criteria. And as you may remember, that's kind of why I, as chair, went through very methodically for each of the standards and criteria that applies. And so I'd ask the commissioners, as we're deliberating tonight, to really be specific on the criteria. If they feel like a certain criteria or standard has not been met, and then to be very specific in what that criteria or standard is that they're referring to for why they would not support the application. Attorney Boone, is there something else that you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just while I certainly agree the commission needs to look at the criteria, you don't approve or deny the application because under subsection 3, in the case where you have a proposed amendment to the zone map, comp map, or to the text of the code, then it's considered a recommendation to council and not a final decision.
Correct. I agree with you, Attorney Boone, and thanks for that clarification. It is indeed a recommendation and not necessarily a decision. Correct. So I'd like to then reopen the deliberation for commissioners. I think the one item that we had tonight was Commissioner Simler, who had been reviewing the record. And Commissioner Simler, would you like to give a summary of your recommendation, or if you'd like to ask any questions related to the standards and criteria that will be used to base our recommendation that you will use to make a recommendation for this application?
And before you do that, Mr. Simler, let me just put on the record, have you reviewed the evidence, that is all of the written materials, and listened to the video tape of the hearing?
Yes, I
Thank you.
have.
All right, you may proceed.
I understand that this is a hot topic within the community and within the greater community. But I kind of go back to what Commissioner Fisher was reiterating several times in our last meeting, that, so much of what we're looking at is hypothetical, and that ultimately whomever the owner and future developer is going to have to, basically make sure that they're able to check all the development boxes, everything, the standards and requirements in order to develop in this additional way. And so with all that being said, after reviewing the documentation and the meetings, the 2 meetings, I've come to the conclusion that the city has checked those boxes, that the additional use should be added, and that whomever owns it in the future will have to basically make sure that they comply in order to develop the property in that way.
Thank you, Commissioner Simler. So based on that, the commission takes that you're in favor for approval based on the standards and the criteria that was outlined. So with that, I'd like to poll the commission once again. I believe supporting the recommendation to approve the application is Commissioner Simler, Commissioner Fisher, and myself. Vice Chair Pape, I believe that your recommendation was against. Again, as I had outlined in the beginning, there is an opportunity to change the decision. Is there any changes to your decision?
Well, I would guess I would ask all commissioners, you might just take another vote.
Correct. I was going to go
Either-
through and
yeah,
ask
either
the individual.
commissioner
Is that okay, Attorney Boone, from a
Sure. You can
procedural?
Take
Yes.
them one at a time and ask them to talk, or just
Yes.
take the vote.
Yeah, correct. I was going to basically go through the commissioners one at a time and ask for any updates. So we'll start with Vice Chair Pape.
Yeah, no, my decision has not changed. My decision has not changed. My vote has not changed.
And
Recommendation.
Vice Chair Pape, would you like to summarize what criteria or standard that you think has not been met?
Mine is purely based on, in my opinion, an insufficient traffic study that was done. I don't believe it was done. I'll just leave it at that. I just don't think it was an appropriate traffic study.
I think it's helpful if we tie it to a specific standard or criteria. Is that something that maybe we could get help from staff? That Vice Chair Pape's concern is that he feels like a traffic study was incomplete. And would staff give any guidance on the impact of a traffic study to a specific criteria or standard that exists before the commission in order to determine whether they recommend or not.
Yeah, Chair Heap, I can give you what I think is the code citation that Commissioner Papade might be referring to. Yeah, it's LOC 50.07.003, and it's let me start over, 50.07.003.1.a.3. And those are the requirements and the criteria for traffic impact studies. And that, I believe, is the criteria that you may be referencing. There are other comprehensive plan policies that address traffic generally and address the impacts of traffic and development. But I think when you talk about adequacy of a study, that's the code section. There is staff commentary in the record that relates to that commissioners may want to refer to, but I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, I think we may want to come back to that. And my intent tonight is to look at the specific sections that commissioners may object to, feeling that the criteria, the standard was not met, and then bring that back to the commission and have some discussion on that. So with that, Vice Chair Pape, I would like to capture that, your support for denial is based on an incomplete traffic study, which then maps to the code. And so I'd like to go through and get the input from the other commissioners and then have discussion on these concerns. All right, Commissioner Leek, again, is there any change that you would like to make in your decision? And again, would you state what the objections where you think the criteria, the standards have not been met?
The decision has not changed. I agree with Commissioner Pape that the traffic impact study was not incomplete, it was just inadequate.
Yeah.
And it was almost self-serving as opposed to really digging into how it would affect a neighborhood. I also feel that the parking situation is inadequate, even though perhaps it meets our parking codes. And I guess I would take umbrage with the whole idea that the planning department has checked the boxes. They've checked the boxes. They haven't taken into consideration the human element. And I guess that really is one of the reasons why I vote no on this.
Well, Commissioner Leek, with that, with your last comment there, the charter of the commission is to develop code, and I think the commission in general, at least myself definitely included, really looks for the community, for the city to follow the code. And so when we come before us tonight to give a recommendation, it's really based on looking at the code, and we're not.
And I feel that because of looking at the code items, those are my two objections: the traffic impact study and the parking situation. So I guess I would go back and say those are the two issues for which I say no.
All right. Again, a question for staff: is there a particular section, unless you want to make reference to a particular section that you're referring to, Commissioner Leek, on the parking? If there's not, I would ask staff: is there some feedback that staff could give on the standards and criteria that apply to the general parking concerns that Commissioner Leek may be raising?
No, I cannot find any criteria that require re-examination of city parking standards with rezones. The comment about the human element might be directed toward the citizen involvement or public involvement policies of the city, which are part of the comprehensive plan, and that's where that's where we were guided towards public meetings, public hearings, information for the public, and that's under citizen engagement or civic engagement, I believe, community culture chapter of the comprehensive plan. So
Okay.
we can try to find some comprehensive plan policies that are more specific if you like, but I'll defer to Commissioner Lee.
Okay, so I've noted that Commissioner Lee main concerns with the standards and criteria is with this traffic study. There's no applicable code that's relating to the parking for the rezone. It did make note that the kind of the human aspect that you raised to it, Commissioner Leek, will be considered under the citizen involvement criteria, and we could discuss that further. Any other concerns with the standards or criteria that's been raised?
No, thank you. That's very complete. I appreciate it.
Chair Heap, I would be remiss if I didn't state, and there are policies in the comprehensive plan that relate to, that actually state, maintain standards and regulations to ensure adequate supply of parking, generally I'm paraphrasing. But those standards are telling us to maintain regulations. And so if we were amending the parking code, we would look at that policy guidance to ensure that we were maintaining appropriate standards. If we were reviewing a development application, those standards are implemented through the code, through the community development code. So there are policies that reference parking, and those are addressed in the application and the staff report and in public testimony that you receive. So I just wanted to be clear that there are policies there, but we didn't interpret those as requiring a reexamination of the parking code.
Okay, thank you, Director Siegel. Commissioner Phillips, again, has your position changed, and would you like to state what standards and criteria you object to for approval, if you, again, have a recommendation of denying?
Okay. I'm the new kid on the block, and I'm working hard to understand the procedure and the process, okay? But I understand parking was my main concern. My belief is that until you understand, and I understand and I'm sorry about the names, I'm not sure of everybody's names yet, but the one gentleman was saying that, we're here to approve the existing stuff as we know it, and there'll be another process when the actual development occurs. I understand that, and I appreciate that. So I guess my first question is, regardless of whether I change my vote or not tonight, based upon the parking criteria in the code, this is already passed as far as a recommendation to the city council.
No, Commissioner Phillips, we have not made a recommendation either to deny, to recommend either denying or approving the application, or approving with conditions.
Right.
So nothing has been
But
determined.
there's 4 in favor now and 3 not in favor at the current. When we vote, that's the current kind of status of where we're at. Am I correct?
The last position we were at was a 3-3 tie on the motion to make a recommendation to the council. I think the motion was to recommend approval, and that failed 3-3. So we don't have a motion with a majority vote yet.
I understand procedurally, but we have a Commissioner Jacob is all, I'm not sure the last name. He was in favor generally of proceeding. Am I correct?
I understand that. Commissioner Stewart, excuse me. Commissioner Stewart is not in attendance tonight, so we're still at 6 commissioners with Commissioner Stewart now.
Okay, I understand. I think I understand where this is going. So my goal all along, when I first got here and I read about this and the parking, and I can't deny the code, Mr. Siegel certainly explained the code to me, how it works on the parking, and I understand that. And I understand that whoever develops the land will have to meet that code no matter what we say or anybody else says, okay? So I understand all of that. My main goal in this whole process about the parking was to identify what I believe will not work in that particular thing regardless of the code. And that's okay. If it's code and that's what happens, it'll be developed. I simply want the city council to understand my position when it goes forward. I've got concern about code being enough parking for that particular project, whatever it is, based upon what I've read. So I can't quote you any particular reason that I'm against the code, other than I just simply, from my experience, don't believe it to work. But that's not what you're asking. You're asking me, did it meet the code? okay? They say they're
Commissioner
gonna meet the code, so who am I
Commissioner-
to argue with that?
Commissioner Phillips, if I may. And also here, as I had outlined in the beginning of our discussions and our deliberation tonight, we're not here to answer arbitrarily questions. We have code in place that exists that directs the Plan Commission on what our task is. And again, if we look at that specific code, which was 50-007-03, it talks about in section G, the decision of the hearing body. And again, we're going very specifically on looking at should the hearing body make a preliminary oral recommendation to approve with conditions, or deny an application based upon, and this is the highlight, based upon the applicable standards and criteria and the evidence and the testimony in the record. And so what I'd ask the commission to do tonight is to be very specific and let's follow the code, as I was mentioning earlier. I think it's very important that we follow the code in everything that we do from a city process perspective. And so based on the code here, it's saying us to look at the applicable standards and look at the criteria and the evidence and the testimony in the record with respect to that applicable standards and criteria and say, does it meet or not? I think some of the higher level questions and objections that may be being raised is outside of the scope of what we've been chartered with as a decision of the hearing body, and that goes more to city council. So I appreciate, those concerns and kind of the great passion that everybody has in, wanting to make sure that the interest of the city is looked after, and that, there's all kinds of concerns, or potentially a number of concerns that commissioners may have, and that they wish that city council, consider that. And I think that's very noteworthy, but specifically what we're looked at tonight is to really look at, the applicable standards and criteria and say, does it meet it or not? And be very focused on what criteria does not meet us, or does not meet. If you wish
Okay,
to
I'm not going to take up much more time. Like I said, I'm trying to figure out how the process works here, based upon what I've read and what I've heard. I understand that the parking, my main concern, will meet code, whoever builds that and develops it. Whether or not the code is what I would like it to be is not relevant. So therefore, I have no problems when I understand things a bit better, changing my mind. So if you're asking me for a change in my vote, I will vote that, but I'm sure there's enough on record now that people understand that parking and traffic are serious issues, but we didn't have to have this commission tell anybody that already. Those were two things that were going to be serious in any development. So yes, I'll change my vote, okay, or change whatever I did last time.
Well, I think it's very helpful for council as we go through, and part of our task here as a commission is to, really provide insight on these specific standards and criteria. So, when there's specific standards like the traffic study, Vice Chair Pape, Commissioner Leak has, raised the concern that they thought the traffic study was inadequate. That type of feedback is very critical to go to council, and I think that's the type of feedback that, they value from the Plan Commission.
Real quickly, I think how Ambassador Leak, or not Ambassador, I'm sorry, Commissioner Leak, I used to work in a different world. Commissioner Leak summarized the traffic study and the parking issues. I can concur with what you said, but I will agree that the code for the parking, which is my main concern, will be met according to everybody, Mr. Siegel, and the paperwork says. So I have no trouble changing my vote based upon more information and following the process, and I beg the indulgence of the commissioners to allow me the time to try and learn something about how the process is going to work.
Thank you, Commissioner Phillips. I would like to ask and give the opportunity to Vice Chair Pape and Commissioner Leak to expand on, and again, this is I think what would be helpful to council, is to expand on very specific concerns they may have with the traffic study. So Vice Chair Pape, is there anything that you'd like to add that would help, guide the council? Commissioner Fisher, sorry, I think I may have skipped that before I come back. Commissioner Fisher, I forgot to ask you, is there any change that you would like to make. I believe previously you had indicated that you were for approval based
No,
on the standards and criteria.
I've probably been obnoxious in my advocacy for my position, so I'll stand by my position. I still am in favor of approving it. I do echo exactly what you said about this being, did the city staff meet the criteria that they were charged with meeting? And the answer, I think, is yes.
Thank you, Commissioner Fisher. Vice Chair Pepe, again, I'd like to allow the opportunity for any specific points that you'd like to make regarding the traffic study and concerns that you have.
Again, much like Commissioner Fisher just mentioned, have probably beaten this point enough, but I do not believe that the city, that their traffic study was sufficient or adequate for what the potential use of this property at its highest maximum could be. And so from that standpoint, I can't, in good conscience, go forward and say, yes, I believe that the city put forth the best or a fully approvable proposal, excuse me.
Thank you, Vice Chair Pepe. If I may ask one question, was the staff had indicated that the traffic study, a large portion of it at least, was based on the fact that we're looking at the zoning. And again, we're not looking at a development application that's outside the scope of the Plan Commission. The development application would be within the scope of the DRC when one would become available. But we're looking at the impact of rezoning it and the traffic study. And so the office and commercial, the Westlake Grove office and commercial zone had supported uses such as daycare. I think that was the example that was given by staff. And then the recommendations on the engineer and the studies that they had stated that the proposed multifamily addition to the Westlake Grove office and commercial district or zone would be less than daycares. So you're taking issue with that, and that you feel like the kind of analysis that was done based on adding multifamily to the zone would be greater, would have a greater impact than the current uses that are allowed within the zone.
So two things. Yes, and then I want to go back to what Commissioner Phillips mentioned, and I believe it was Commissioner Leak. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding why we're going through this process. I don't know that there's going to be any new revelations from any commissioners on their points or their stances, going back through and trying to itemize out in specificity, where you can go back and look on the record at any one of the commissioners' stances based on any one of the points that we went through methodically at our last meeting. So I guess I would kind of raise a question as to why go through this process when we could start holding either a straw poll vote or an actual vote and move forward this process and put it into whichever category, whether it's, I believe it will get passed, or does it get passed with certain concerns. But going back through and bringing backup points that have been mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, is this the fourth commission meeting that we've discussed this? I don't see the relevance in that.
Vice Chair Pepe, if I may respond. I would like to go through it because I think we are very close. We are going to take a vote. But I really want to ensure that the Plan Commission is giving a good recommendation back to Council, and that it's very crystal clear what the Commissioner's concerns were based on the standards and criteria that was collected based on all the testimony and the hearing that we had. I felt like in our earlier discussions You know, there was, as we heard even tonight, I think there was some general objections. And I don't think that's too helpful to the council. And so I really want to ground it back. I don't want to dwell on it, but I want to make sure that it's really crystal clear that when we're looking at the relevant standards and criteria, that we understand where there was commissioners' concerns, what those specific concerns were. And I would like to allow the opportunity for the commissioners to basically, you know, be able to voice their specific standards and criteria concerns where they felt it wasn't met. And I think that'll be very helpful to council. So we're not going to dwell on it, but we're going to give the opportunity for that type of input to be fed back to the council. So again, the final opportunity, Commissioner Leek, is there anything that you would like to add that you think would be important for council to know with respect to traffic and the standards and the criteria that applies to those standards for why you feel like the traffic study does not meet the criteria to make a recommendation for approval?
I agree with Commissioner Pepe that we have already made our statements as to why we do not agree with the study. And I think we're just prolonging this process, and I have nothing else to add. I think I've already stated very clearly in what my objections are.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Lee. So with that, I would ask if there is a motion. Well, I guess I'd like to make a motion then to preliminary make a recommendation to the council for approval of LU 21-0019. And this is a change to the comprehensive plan map, change to the zoning map, and amend the community development code to allow the multifamily in the West Lake Grove office and commercial zone. Is there a second on the motion for approving the recommendations for initially approving, preliminary approving the recommendation?
Second?
There's a second. Now there can be discussion on the motion. Commissioner Phillips.
Why is it preliminary? When does it become not preliminary?
Yeah, so what we're doing, right, if I may answer, Attorney Boone, you may correct me, but I was just going to say.
What this motion is essentially a direction to staff to prepare the written findings for the commission to review, and then we would take a second vote on approval of those findings, because that's the important part, to convey which criteria is met and which isn't, that sort of thing. And so that vote on the adoption of written findings is the final decision of the commission.
Okay, so there will be a document, then we read it, and then we approve that document, is what you're saying.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Correct. And so there's a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on the motion? There's no further discussion. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Fisher,
Yes.
Heap,
Yes?
Leek,
No,
Pepe,
No?
Phillips,
Yes.
Semler,
Yes.
Thank you. The motion is to recommend the preliminary approval of the findings from
Right,
staff and come
yes.
back.
Staff will be back to you then on August 23rd at your next meeting with written findings.
Thank you.
And those are distributed to the commission in draft form prior to the meeting, so you have them typically, I think, the week before, or by Friday the week before.
All right, thank you. So next, we'll move on to our next agenda item. This is a work session on the flood overlay. Paul Espy is our staff member. Staff, would you like to give us an introduction?
Chair Heap, we have, along with Mr. Espy, we have Rob Amesbury, who's our floodplain manager and engineering specialist for this project.
Commissioner Phillips, I believe you had a question on the agenda. So this is a work session tonight on the flood overlay, and we're going to hear an initial presentation from staff. The public comments are accepted. Iris, was there anyone that wished to make a public comment that we heard from tonight on the flood overlay? Iris? Was there anyone who wished to make a public comment tonight on the flood overlay? All right. So with that, staff, Paul, if you'd like to give us an introduction.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Chair Heap, members of the commission, good evening. Staff is providing information and a timeline for amending the flood hazard overlay code. And I have with me Rob Amsbury, floodplain manager, with us this evening, who can provide answers to questions regarding technical details about this ordinance, of which it's fairly complex. So the proposed amendments are required to ensure continued compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. These amendments need to be completed by the FEMA deadline of January 1st, 2022. This is the flood hazard map that we work with. And it shows Oswego Lake here, Oswego Canal, the Tualatin River, the Willamette River. And it has, it's hard to see, I know, it's fairly small, but it has zone AE, which is the special flood hazard area, where a base flood elevation is determined. It corresponds to the 100-year flood zone. Zone X is where the 0.2% annual chance of a flood hazard is predicted, or corresponds to a 500-year flood. And Zone A is where no base flood elevation is determined based on inadequate data, and usually that corresponds to some of the more far-flung tributaries, like some of the creeks throughout the city. The model ordinance was developed in response to a change in FEMA's requirements for the language that must be included in local floodplain regulations to achieve compliance with the minimum national flood insurance program and state standards. The city participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, which aims to reduce the impact of flooding on private and public structures. It achieves this by providing insurance to property owners, renters, and businesses, and by encouraging communities to adopt these floodplain regulations. The new Oregon Model Ordinance will be used by FEMA Region 10 and the Department of Land Conservation and Development, or DLCD, as the review tool for evaluating local ordinances for NFIP compliance. FEMA now expects local codes to mirror, and in some cases, be verbatim to the federal NFIP rule language, and the new model ordinance, which was provided as an attachment, is designed to provide minimum standard language from FEMA, and that is the process that we have all been engaged in the last year or so. The DLCD has notified the city that it needs to amend its land use regulations for development within the flood management area overlay to be consistent with the model ordinance, which is attached. And the DLCD is responsible for administering the statewide planning program, including statewide planning goal 7, which requires that local comprehensive plans and implementing regulations address Oregon's natural hazards. So protecting people and property from natural hazards requires knowledge, planning, coordination, and education. Local jurisdictions are also responsible for adopting and maintaining land use regulations, implementing their plans that are consistent with statewide goals. Flood hazard areas are subject to periodic inundation, which may result in loss of life and property, present health and safety hazards, and disruption of commerce and governmental services. This can also result in public expenditure for flood protection, which adversely affects the health, safety, and general welfare of its residents and property owners. So the purpose, the state has a delegated responsibility to local governments in ORS 197-175 to adopt floodplain management regulations. And the purpose of continuing the flood management area designation and mapping is to notify potential buyers that a property is located within these special flood hazard overlays. The flood management area designation and mapping also serves to notify those who occupy special flood hazard areas that they assume responsibility for their actions. Following the flood management area requirements will allow property owners to continue to maintain eligibility for their flood insurance and disaster relief. This is just a quick overview of all of the code sections that will be revised to accommodate those provisions that are found in the model ordinance. The model ordinance has all of those things in the body of language, and they are distributed to all of their respective code sections that you see in this list here. And again, the objectives to restrict development that is dangerous to health, safety, and property, and protect development vulnerable to floods. Much of this FEMA Region 10 model ordinance language is pulled verbatim from the code of federal CFR regulations in an FIP language. And the DLCD assessed Lake Oswego Code Section 500511 using the framework that DLCD and FEMA use for code review purposes. And their assessment identified several places where the language in the city code does not adequately reflect the minimum recent NFIP standards for review and permitting of development in the FEMA map special flood hazard area. So that's what we've been working on is implementing those discrepancies that are provided in the model code to update our code. So some of the scope, restricting or prohibiting development that is dangerous to health, safety, and property due to water or erosion hazards, or which result in damaging increases in erosion or flood heights or velocities. And 2, requiring that development vulnerable to floods be protected against flood damage in the time of initial construction. 3, controlling the alteration of natural floodplains, stream channels, and natural protective barriers which help accommodate or channel floodwaters. Controlling, filling, grading, dredging, and other development that may increase flood damage. And lastly, preventing or regulating the construction of flood barriers that will unnaturally divert floodwaters or may increase flood hazards in other areas. And so key changes, we are modifying definitions to align with FEMA's model code, coordinating with state specialty codes, adding a floodplain review requirement, record retention requirements, FEMA notification requirements, and addresses substantial improvements and substantial damage assessments. And so to achieve consistency with the model ordinance, we've provided a breakdown of the primary changes found in the 2019 model ordinance, and it's summarized here and in the attached memo, and will also appear in the staff report that you will see at the first evidentiary hearing for this matter. Additional changes include subdivisions, such structures located in multiple or partial flood zones, flood openings, and garages, and the riverine flood zone section has also been reorganized. Our biggest sticking point, of course, was, since we are in a lake community, our accessory structures and boathouses. Currently, boathouses are allowed with minimal setback to adjacent property lines and allowed to straddle a lake property line or the lake core property line between, that property and the lake, so that the boathouses can actually access the water and accommodate boats. The maximum area of a boathouse is set by the city code at 600 square feet, and the lake core regulations set it at 500 square feet. So we have addressed that discrepancy as well. Additionally, the current code allows for permitted boathouses with finished floor elevations set below the design flood elevation to be wet flood proofed, which means, and Rob can probably elaborate on this, which means basically to allow enough venting for water to pass through and avoid any kind of damage that would be caused by inundation, and allow the boathouse or accessory structure to stay in place during a flood event. Unfortunately, the model flood hazard ordinance restricts the size of an accessory structure on a residentially zoned property to less than 200 square feet. So, and it also imposes a minimum setback of 20 feet from all of the property lines, which is a significant departure from the boathouses that we see today on the lake. It would really probably not work for us. And then in addition, any residential structure that does not meet the requirements needs to be built with its finished floor elevation above the design flood elevation, and wet flood proofing for these structures is not an option. I provided some photographs of the typical scenario that we see on the lake with common lot line, or boathouses that have common lot property lines, as you see here. And these same boathouses are shown as an aerial view. The lines don't show up very well, but you can see here, the Lake Core property line here, and then the common property line transecting these two boathouses here. And then this shows it up a little bit more brighter in the plan view. And these are the same property lines, or properties, of course. So to allow a path forward for the continued construction or substantial improvement of traditional boathouses that we see on the lake today, the code amendments include a ministerial floodplain variance for boathouses that are greater than 200 square feet and not more than 500 square feet, which is the cap for boathouses imposed by the Lake Corps. And then we'd also allow wet floodproofing of those accessory structures through that variance process as well. The city's also considered what are known as the community or area-wide exceptions. Once the amended flood management code provisions have been adopted, the city will consider making a request for community-wide exception for boathouses. And this is language that is created by FEMA, and it enables a larger group of boathouses to be constructed or substantially remodeled without the necessity of obtaining a variance. Rather, the construction or substantial remodel would be authorized through an exception in the code as approved by FEMA. So it's kind of more of a blanket variance for a number of boathouses in a given specific area. But at this point, FEMA has not completed its review of necessary standards and criteria to develop that community area-wide exception code language further. So we have to wait a little bit before we can actually enter into that process.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Paul, but that's a really important point that you're making, because we did spend quite a bit of time exploring this option with FEMA. And there is a path that's provided in their policy that allows for community-wide exceptions. But it really hasn't been tested, and they have to develop the administrative procedures and policies to administer the program of community-wide exceptions for these accessory structures. So we have to wait for them to have the system in place to process that request. In the meantime, we're under an order to bring our code up to standard, so that's why we're doing this.
Yep. Thanks, Scott. Okay, and finally, our timeline and process. We are here at the work session tonight. And then we are going to do some public outreach. We'll probably send a press release to be published in the LOLO, local newspapers, and city website that we are completing this work. And because the code changes are mandated by state and federal government, FEMA is not permitting local governments to make substantive or even minor changes to the model ordinance language. In fact, they've required local adoption of much of the ordinance language to be verbatim with their model ordinance. And so the citizen involvement process is a little bit different in this scenario because it emphasizes public information more so than direct involvement with crafting the regulations or development of policy around this particular body of work. And so the question is, when must we complete? And it has to be completed by FEMA's deadline of January 1st, 2022. And I or Rob are open for any questions that you might have about this.
And before you go there, we might just say a few words about the public information piece to this, because that is really important. That we started with outreach with the Lake Corps, because they're the owners who are most directly affected by these changes for boathouses. And Paul, maybe you could discuss a little bit about the next steps, and that there's noticing that's required and how that works so we can get information out.
Right, so before the first hearing for the Planning Commission, we would have to have noticing to the DLCD as well as noticing to all of the property owners around the lake or that are in the flood zone, and that these changes are occurring to the code.
And probably get a lot of phone calls and answer questions and make sure there's plenty of time to walk people through this before it comes to you. That's the process that we're in. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Questions from commissioners. Vice Chair Pape.
So a couple of questions. One, this only impacts those beginning, January 1, 2022, who are gonna be either building and or substantially remodeling their boathouse. Am I correct on that?
Well, it will affect anybody that has a structure in the flood zone, and they will need to, all the flood zone standards would apply to anybody that has a structure in the flood zone. We brought out the boathouse issue because that was probably the biggest sticking point that we had, since boathouses are located right on the water, and it presented a much more unique circumstance for us to be able to continue to allow those, while we're still adhering to all of the floodplain requirements.
Okay, so
But-
somebody else in that floodplain.
But there are other properties that are,
Right, but so another property owner who is in floodplain, who has a garden shed
right,
of 250 square feet, right? They wouldn't fall under this special variance if theirs was closer than 20 or 40 feet from property line, they would need to then relocate their structure or potentially move it a foot or more. Am I missing something?
Well, I'm gonna make sure Rob agrees with me on this down here, but I don't believe it applies to existing structures. I mean, there's no requirement to remove your
Oh, okay, that's good.
existing structure.
Okay, so it does then go back to, if you're gonna substantially remodel and or build, that's what this
Right.
pertains to.
That's
Everybody else is grandfathered in.
Essentially, yes, that's correct.
Okay,
Yes, grandfathered in to deteriorate. Okay. Okay. I mean, yes, when you start,
you can make minor
minor
improvements.
Yeah, under the 50% cap, okay, for substantial improvements then.
R-
50%, and I think that's on an annual basis.
That makes sense, okay.
and that's the value, that's the valuation, that's not the, right? It's not the structure, it's the value of
Right.
improvements.
It's the market value of the structure. So if you exceed 50.
Versus the improvements needing, correct?
If the proposed improvements exceed 50% of the market value of the structure, then it becomes a substantial improvement, and therefore it has to be brought up to current code standards.
Okay. And then are there going to be additional costs to secure a special variance?
Well, we're
Has
trying
that
to,
been-
you know, we haven't discussed fees, but the goal is to make this process turnkey, essentially a ministerial process where it meets a prescribed set of requirements, and therefore the staff time, the overhead is very low. The fee accordingly should be very low to reflect that workload.
Okay.
So I don't have an answer, I don't have a number, but that's the goal.
And not living on the lake, is there already a fee for somebody who makes or improves their boathouse?
There's not a city fee for that. I mean, when they apply for their building permits, there's no separate fee set up for floodplain reviews.
Right, that's one of the, I mean, that's a symptom of a larger problem that we don't, I mean, we're not recovering the cost, but the problem is that we don't actually have a floodplain development permit. So these improvements or these projects that do not trigger a building permit or a land use review are essentially happening, or, you know, could have happened without any review, you know, without any reference to the code or FEMA standards, which is, you know, it's not in the property owner's interest to have that happening, because we're trying to maintain flood insurance and everything else.
Right.
So I think this formalizes it, but we want to keep it as streamlined and you know, customer friendly as we can.
Sure. My only concern is with this, I guess to just be cognizant of what those fees might be, because through no fault of their own, if you will, they're needing to apply.
Right.
Is that?
Yeah, right. You don't want to make the fees a barrier to entry towards compliance. Yeah.
Thank you, Vice Chair Pepe. Commissioner Sumler or Commissioner Fisher, I'll check in with you on Zoom. Or Commissioner Leak, if you're still on too, I'm not sure. But any commissioners on Zoom, any questions? Commissioner Sumler?
I had a quick question about the change in the setback rule. What's the difference between the 20-foot setback and putting it up against the property line? How is that going to change from a flood standpoint? what's FEMA saying about that?
Well, the way FEMA has it categorized, and they worked with the Oregon Building Codes, is there's restrictions implemented through the Oregon Building Code, which trickled down to the floodplain code, that limit those setbacks. And I don't know if that's a life fire safety issue when you've got buildings stacked against other buildings. They didn't offer a clear explanation for that. They just derived it from the Oregon building codes and put it into the model floodplain code.
Got it. I had another question is, from a new construction standpoint, and the reason I'm asking this is I did a due diligence report for a family in Manzanita for a piece of property, and it had recently been designated as being within the floodplain. And the city's restrictions based on the zone of property only allowed a certain building height. So all of a sudden, your base floodplain elevation went up 10 feet because of FEMA's designation, and the building footprint, went from being able to have a 2-story to all of a sudden having a 1-story structure on it because of natural elevation and the floodplain. You had to build above it. So all of a sudden, the property value dropped dramatically, which could be advantageous for a buyer, but not necessarily for a seller or a developer. And so, I don't know, is the city looking into any modifications based on building height, based on baseline flood elevation changing, and being able to say that if the floodplain elevation goes up, your building footprint, basically the height of your building can go up based on that baseline flood elevation? Is, I don't know, Dr. Siegel or anyone else thinking or looking at that?
Well, we're not looking at changing the allowed building height to anticipate any increase in the base flood elevation. You look at Mr. Amesbury, because I think the base flood elevation actually went down when the dam, or when the spillway was repaired
on the lake. It did.
So we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, got it. Okay, just wondering. I just felt badly for the owners of that property, because it was like, well, they didn't change it, and all of a sudden they're stuck with this property that potentially couldn't be developed. So that's good. Thank you.
Commissioner Fisher, Commissioner Leak, anyone else on Zoom would like to raise a question?
It just, am I right that we don't really have a choice? And so any discussion we're having maybe involve a variance or two, but this is a done deal? Am I missing that?
No, I think you hit it spot on.
It has to be adopted in some form, and FEMA prefers verbatim. So, yes. The challenge was fitting all the parts that FEMA wants in the correct sections that we have, because, their model rule is organized around the tunnel. That's all they're looking at. We have to put it into our whole code. And so there's the application process, there's the review process, there's maps, there's definitions, all this sort of thing. So that's why it took so long. But to your point, there's not a lot we can tinker with without requiring further FEMA review. And I mean, my experience was it's almost the is it or them? And sometimes their language is wrong, but they want it that way. I mean, just grammatically. So we were stuck with that. So I don't take any pride of authorship for that. And we do have to comply soon in order to maintain our community flood insurance. So yes, but I suppose if you have any great revelations on how we can package it differently, or put it in a different section of the code to make it more understandable, or something like that, certainly all ears open. But this has been an 18-month process, I guess I would say, at this point.
Thank you.
No other questions on Zoom. Commissioner Phillips, you had your light on. Do you still have a question? Or?
Well, after Commissioner Fisher's comment, I probably don't have much to add. I was sitting here thinking how long I could live in Lake Oswego if I voted against this, okay? So the way I understand it is, the way you understand it is, make sure I'm correct here, if the City of Lake Oswego does not adopt these changes by 1 January 2022, the people that live in the floodplains of Lake Oswego would not be able to purchase the federally funded, subsidized, or whatever you call it, insurance. Is that a correct statement?
That is, we would go into
Okay,
a probationary status until.
Whether or not they should be living in that is a whole different question, okay? And I won't even go any further than that. So, thank you. You've answered my question.
Vice Chair Pepe?
I guess my question really pertains to, over the last 18 months, what other jurisdictions have you reached out to figure out how are they adopting and/or are they able to push back or change or influence FEMA? For instance, Lake Union or Lake Washington up in Seattle, or Coeur d'Alene or Lake Chelan or Devil's Lake, where they have similar situations. I'm thinking Lake Washington and Union will have a little bit more pull than some of the others, but.
King County is the only county in the nation, the only community in the nation that has applied for the community-wide exception. And basically, it's been sitting on a shelf since they applied, because FEMA headquarters in DC does not have the tools in place to review and approve a community-wide exception. So they are, up in Washington, they are pursuing that. If you look at a lot of the structures on those lakes in Washington, Coeur d'Alene Lake, the river, you'll notice that most of those boat houses are floating docks that rise and lower with the tide or with the water levels. Lake Oswego is unique, where you have your boathouses built into the embankment next to the lake, and you drive your boats into them rather than have them floating on a platform out in the lake. So it's, we tried to make the argument. We put together a presentation. We presented to DLCD and to FEMA to show them the uniqueness of the situation here. And there's no give in the situation. They said, first thing we have to do is adopt the code, develop the variance process, and if we want to pursue a community-wide exception, follow through with their, they have criteria spelled out in one of their documents that they produced last year that tells you what steps need to be made and how to justify getting the community-wide exception. So boat houses of this type, you don't see a lot of them. Just do a Google Earth on Lake Washington and their docks that are floating with basically little pole barns that put a cover over it. If your structure doesn't have walls on it, it's not considered an accessory structure and it's allowed. But if you're building brick buildings and you're putting bathrooms in them, or if you're building stone or steel buildings that are actual structures, like you see many of on the lake, that's what they're looking at.
So during their process, King County, are they still able to get flood insurance?
They can get flood insurance, but they've adopted the code, but they have gone on a parallel track and they have
Oh, I see.
filled out the application for a community-wide exception. In the meantime, they are in the same situation we are, where they're being required to issue variances.
Okay. Thank you.
And one thing about variances that it actually required a little bit of a mind shift to understand how FEMA thinks about variances. They're not variances in the sense that Lake Oswego hardship variance, very high bar, almost has to be a taking of property before, that's issued. They have specific language in their guidelines that are around water dependent or, water related accessory structures, and that's the variance path that we're following. They do have guidance in their documents for how variances should be approached, and we're following that.
Thank you.
Commissioners on Zoom, any additional questions? None. I did have, Commissioner Sumler, you'd like to ask a question?
Just a general question, maybe not completely related to FEMA, but is it possible to change the shoreline if you're a property owner on the lake? Just wondering.
Well, most of the property that surrounds the lake is owned by the Lake Corp, so I guess that would depend on what it is you're proposing to do and if they would agree with that. I think there's very few properties that have actually lakefront abut the water surface.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Just wondering. Thank you.
Oh, so one question I had was, in the updates that we're making to the code, are the flood maps actually changing at all? No. And so there had been a lot of press. One of the concerns I had, and I think this is going back to like 2019, 2020, maybe even earlier, is that the FEMA maps have been notoriously wrong and inaccurate. And then that the community has a sense of, security that they're relying on the map, they're relying on all these ordinances and things that we're putting in place to help protect them. But yet, if the underlying map is incorrect, then it's a false sense of security. So has the city looked at that, and do we feel comfortable that the FEMA maps are accurate in Lake Oswego? My other question too would be, we talked a lot about the boathouses, but I'm thinking also, if we look at where floodings occurred in Lake Oswego, I think it was around 96 that it was actually the foothills area in downtown here that flooded. And so is there any consideration to the impacts that may be involved with the downtown or foothills area?
Well, the Willamette, I'll answer your second question first. Sure. Foothills flooded in 96. It flooded from Lakewood Base, building over State Street, but it also flooded from back up from the Willamette River. The State Street problem's been resolved with the reconstruction of the spillway at Oswego Lakes Dam facility there. That will now spill the 100-year flood event. So in a 100-year flood, we wouldn't expect to see water over State Street. The Willamette River will still back up, and on the Willamette River, we actually regulate to a standard that's higher than FEMA's. We regulate to the area of inundation of the 1996 flood. That river system has not been studied since the mid-'80s, and there's a study in place right now to study the hydrology of that river, and that may reflect in updated maps at some point in the future. It's not a FEMA process that's doing it, it's Army Corps of Engineers that are in the middle of that process right now of modeling that river system. So you could potentially see changes to the floodplain there along the lines of what happened in 96. So a raise in the base flood elevation. So that's the Willamette system. Your question on the lake, could you?
The first question was just the accuracy of the maps in general,
yeah.
And that the public, at least it's been a lot of public attention placed on the fact that the maps have been notoriously inaccurate. And so does the city of Lake Oswego have any concerns with the accuracy of the maps and giving a false security or false sense of security based on the maps?
So the maps are a tool, and they are inaccurate to the degree that they are based on aerial photography, which has its limitations. And so when I talk to people about the maps, what I generally do is refer also to the flood insurance study, which is the meat and the potatoes. It's the math, it's the engineering that developed the maps. The maps are accurate within plus or minus 2 feet because the aerial standards that they used at the time to shoot those maps, we have 2-foot contours on our topography maps. So that's the relative accuracy of the mapping system, but the flood insurance study studies to the 1/10 of a foot. And so when I do a floodplain determination for a property on the canal or on the Willamette River, I use the flood insurance studies, which have profiles. They have the mathematical calculations for the width of the stream that were taken into consideration when they developed the maps. And that information is much more accurate, and that's what we rely on when we do these determinations.
Thank you. Commissioners, any other questions? I see none. Is there any direction that staff would like from the commission? Any questions? No?
No, I think we are looking for at the evidentiary hearing, we're looking for direction, approval, of course, and recommendation to the city council to approve the proposed revisions to the flood code.
Right, thank you.
What's the tentative, or what's the scheduled hearing date, Paul, so we can,
Scheduled hearing date is, let me go back. Yeah, city council hearing is on December 7th, and then the first evidentiary hearing for planning commission would be September 27th.
so we would anticipate notices going out to those property owners. They have to be mailed not less than 20 days before the hearing and not more than 40 days.
Yeah.
For some reason, that's the
Right.
state law, so I think we're
Right.
trying to hit the longer timeframe, is that right, Iris?
Yeah, we'll probably use the flood, or the deadline of 35 days for DLCD to push all the notices out at that point, which is around August 23rd, I think, somewhere around there. Iris will make sure I'm correct on that.
Vice Chair Pepe, you have a question?
Yeah, just a follow-up on the notices, Director Siegel or Mr. Esty. When those go out, knowing my time here on the commission, there are a lot of pockets within the city's boundaries that are in the county. Well, one, are there any properties in the county, still within the City of Lake Oswego boundaries, that are affected? And will they also get notices from the City of Lake Oswego, or will that come from the county?
Oh, that's a good question. So only those properties that are inside the city that have city zoning are actually affected by the code changes. So the city doesn't notify unincorporated properties of changes to the city code.
Okay.
That's the short answer.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no other questions for the commission, so staff is okay, we can conclude the work session for tonight.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. Next is other business. I didn't have any other business. Final item is the schedule review. Is there any schedule updates you'd like to give us, Director Siegel?
Thank you, Chair Heaps. Your next meeting is scheduled on August 23rd, and as you heard earlier this evening, we're prepared to present draft findings to you for the hearing that you just completed this evening. We don't have any other business scheduled. I don't believe we have any other items scheduled for that meeting, although staff was contacted by a representative of the Palisades Neighborhood Association, and they're interested, I believe they're interested in talking with the Planning Commission at some point. We don't have a date scheduled yet, and I'd suggested that they come to a future Planning Commission meeting just to introduce themselves and to talk with you about their idea, which is to develop an overlay zone for the neighborhood or a portion of the neighborhood. I understand it's something that their members have been working towards, but without, Planning Commission or City Council direction, it's not yet on our work program, and I think they really would like to discuss that idea with you.
Thank you, Director Siegel. And in full disclosure, I am a member, an area rep, and I live in the Palisades Neighborhood Association, and I participate in the Palisades Neighborhood Association. So I was aware that they're wanting an overlay. I don't think, I know they're working on it, but I haven't heard of any specifics yet. And I know they're reaching out to me to have some discussions. So I'll follow up with staff, and hopefully we can arrange a time when they can speak with the commission here about kind of their intentions and the background and any overlays that they're wanting. All right, so nothing else on schedule review, we'll adjourn. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Good night. Thanks.
Good night, everybody.
Hey, thank you.